I think we're live. Hello, everyone, for Soul Speak conversations to connecting you to who you truly are. And today I have a very, very special guest, Jessica Frey, with us, and we will be talking about how to stop living like small men. And when I first met Jessica, in our conversation, we talked about so many wonderful things. She mentioned this concept of living like small men, and I was so intrigued that I had to bring her to the group and share her wonderful thoughts. So with that, I welcome Jessica.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Always fun to meet you online and not be able to see you. Yay. Hopefully you can see me.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, as you say that, let me double check that we are live. And while I do that, why don't you tell everyone that's joining us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. So my name's Jessica Frey, and I work as a women's health coach. So I like introducing myself at networking events as the woman that talks about all the taboo subjects: sex, pee, poop, periods, pregnancy, postpartum care, and menopause. And yes, people either step towards me or they very quietly back away and don't talk to me all evening.
I love it. I do love it. Yeah, those are a lot of subjects that many of us do or don't want to talk about. Mm-hmm. However, it's important to talk about.
And I jokingly call it taboo, but the sad part is many people do feel uncomfortable talking about them. So, one of the reasons I make that joke and I smile while doing it is to open up the conversation of, yes, I am someone you can talk to about these subjects. The things that you might not feel comfortable saying to your best friend or your mom or your doctor, or the more common thing in almost probably 50% of the first conversations I have with a woman is reassuring her that, no, you're not crazy. It's your biology. Like, there is an explanation for what's going on. Fair, PSA announcement. I'm not a doctor. I don't diagnose, but I love to read. I love this subject, and I am willing to go both the Western side and the alternative medicine side. And you don't always get people who are willing to sit in the middle and be uncomfortable with not picking a side that is right.
Okay, beautiful. I love that. And so as we begin, I would love for you to share a little bit or explain a little bit of the paradigm you're coming from I know I love the title just because it's provocative and challenging, right? Stop living like small men. Mm-hmm. But share your perspective on that title.
Yeah. So why I say that is a lot of our society is, we live in a patriarchy, right? Like we live in a society where the baseline for so many things, including in medicine, is men. Meaning, for example, we were talking about this earlier. I had this conversation earlier in the week where someone in the medical field said, oh yeah, the signs and symptoms of stroke for women are atypical. Well, when we first decided what the signs and symptoms of a stroke were, we based them off what men experienced, usually white, middle-class, 40-year-old men. And that became the medical definition of what a stroke looks like. And it wasn't for almost 30 years that we realized, oh, it looks different in women. And even today, we now know it looks different in women, but we call it atypical instead of typical for women or typical for men. So in a lot of medicine and a lot of health, the baseline for what we decide is normal or typical is male. And you see that all over in pharmaceutical research, where we research things on men first. And it wasn't until 2015 that we actually passed a law that says all drugs that come to market also have to be researched on women. And that was 2015. So when I say don't live like small men, I mean, we define success by the male model. Like, what does that look like? High-powered executive, wealthy, power comes up frequently, has the family, but is, a hard go-getter and dedicated to their job, because they offsource taking care of the family to their significant other, right?
Right.
Or we talk about, success, happiness. Again, a lot of how we define happiness is based on being a man, being, that successful, powered person. And a lot of our mental health, we have a history when you talk about happiness of having had conditions that we diagnosed women with, like hysteria, that were basically, when you look at the definitions, you're like, oh, it's someone who menstruates and who has hormones that change over 20, 24, 28, 31, however, long your cycle every month, versus someone who shows up the exact same way every single day because they have a 24-hour cycle, which would be the male model, versus 24-hour cycle, which is a circadian rhythm, plus what's called the infradian rhythm, which is your menstrual cycle. So,
wow. Okay. So I want to pause there.
Okay.
There's so many things to unpack.
So many things.
I'm just outraged. At his hysteria, right?
Yep.
Because at the same time, I love watching like older movies and older shows. And it shocks me when there are pieces about, these little pill packs or these mineral things that they gave women for their menstrual cycle. Like, oh, you are crazy and hysterical. And so therefore we have actually, I want to say it was like heroin and that kind of stuff back then as a way to placate them and then, let them behave.
Yeah. Yeah. Ironically, two of the most common treatments for hysteria, and keep in mind, I'm not a mental health therapist, so I've not done a huge dive, but this is one of those areas where I was curious, was things like various drugs. And another one was what we might today call vibrators or, orgasm inducers. Like, it was hilarious that in this very, straight conservative, we don't do these things, these women are out of control. Those were the two methods of treatment. And there were also some really grim ones. Like there were women who were hospitalized and institutionalized for things that were labeled hysteria. So I make light of it, but there were also long-term consequences for it.
Unbelievable. So I wanted to just shout out to all those watching us. Hi, Yvonne. And ask the question, has anyone felt as if they struggled with trying to fit this paradigm of having to almost become like a small man? I mean, I know for myself, thinking of, being in the workforce and trying to climb up the corporate ladder, that yes, there were times where I felt as if, right or wrong, right? Granted, now I want to embrace the possibility that it's wrong, that I have to be anything other than myself, but that yes, in order to be quote unquote successful, we need to put pants on and be like men. We need to be very analytical and decisive and to take all those touchy-feely emotions and put them aside. So I'm curious, anyone else ever experienced that? I would love to hear in the comments. And
I did.
What about you, Jessica?
I did. In the corporate world, I definitely did. Yeah, I think many women have had that experience that, I don't know if you are a huge Tom Hanks fan or not, but that there's no crying in baseball from
yes,
A League of Their Own.
That is such a classic line.
Yeah.
And I actually say that all the time now. There's no crying in politics. There's no crying in a meeting, right? There's no crying in baseball. Yeah.
Yes. And yet the weird dichotomy is that, you're supposed to have that stiff upper lip, there's no crying, I'm going to not show my emotions unless it's positive ones, like I won type thing, like that celebratory victory dance type emotion of we won the account, we got the this, we got the that. And yet at work, women also do a lot of the emotional work. Who is it that makes sure that the birthday card goes around and everyone signs it, that makes sure someone's birthday, whatever your company does for birthdays gets acknowledged and done? that organizes luncheons, that signs up. So it's this weird dichotomy where the ideal is you're not supposed to show these emotions, and yet women do all of this extra emotional work at work as part of their jobs, because usually it's delegated to them or they feel comfortable doing it, so they step up to do it. But having worked in an industry that was 70 to 80% male, I have also been the only woman on a team. And so I did a lot of this work just to make things go smoothly, because I wanted my project to go smoothly. I wanted us to be successful, and I wanted hassle to go down. So I remember doing a lot of that emotional work as well, while still being one of the boys. It was weird.
Yes. And that reminds me of the concept of caretaker, right? Or caretaking, that we as women tend to shoulder or burden the responsibility for.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of that is, so this is where I start doing my like biology anatomy nerd thing, is that some of it is definitely nurture, and some of it's definitely nature, right? So if you've ever heard of fight, flight, or freeze, I cannot say that 3 times fast. That's what we think of when we get stressed, right? You're gonna run away from the tiger that's coming at you, or you're gonna fight it, or you're gonna freeze and be the little thing hiding from it. Well, again, that's a male model, or that is the largely testosterone response to danger and threat. The more common, although women definitely do the fight, flight, or freeze, the mama bear who protects her cubs, you don't mess with the grizzly mama bear. That's like, that way lies danger. But women in stressful situations, and this is more of an estrogen response, tend to do what's called tend and befriend, which makes a lot of sense. And it's part of the caretaking thing. So when you think about women as historically being the primary caregiver, and primary caregivers, we know now through beautiful things like MRIs and CAT scans, whatever your gender are, when you're a primary caregiver, certain things light up in your brain, meaning you are more risk averse, you are more cautious, all the things you would want someone who's taking care of a baby or a small child to be. So we know that biologically we're much more, our brains are much more plastic than we thought. We always thought that was more a female thing because women primarily did the caretaking. We now know, if you, through doing MRIs and CAT scans on gay couples, that whichever partner becomes the primary caregiver, their brain also lights up the same way. So that's just a nifty thing for where caretaking is kind of linked to biology, but it's not predestined. It's not you're the woman, therefore you will be, you have to. It may be that society and your own biology, like say childbirth and having a child, lends you down a path that sets you to more caretaking roles. But when I say this, that there's a biological component, I never want it to feel predestined, like you were born female and therefore you must be. I'm like, no, not quite that black and white. We have free choice. We can pick on the spectrum.
Awesome. So can you tell me again? So I'm gonna mess it up myself. I know this: fight, flight, and freeze. But with caretaking, it's tend and befriend.
And befriend. And so what that looks like in a stress response is there's this thing called, I'll just throw out the big word, polyvagal theory. And it's about how we react to stress. And one of them is societally. It's called the social nervous system. So think about if you've ever been in a room and there's loud noise outside, maybe a car backfired or something like that. And you're like, okay, what is that? And you're looking around and you look around, you're like, okay, I'm calm. Everyone around me is calm. Maybe you're out in the street and there are a bunch of people and there's a loud noise. It sounds like a car crashing. But everyone seems okay. You're like, oh, okay, we must be okay. So we're social creatures. We take a lot of social cues from other people. And so that's the first stress response. And then if it's not soothed socially, like if you don't feel safe afterwards because, oh no, actually there's murmuring over there, and I heard that loud sound. So now I'm going to pay attention. This is where a woman might jump into tend and befriend. So she might look for, does she have any children with her? Does she have any family members? Who are the people we need to like huddle together to maybe move away or forward? And fight or freeze is a more forward, I'm going to go confront the issue, right? Freeze is obviously staying where you are. That is just the petrified reaction. And so does that explain a little where tend and befriend?
It does. And gosh, it just makes me think, I'm like right now, right? Because we were talking a little bit about stress, and it just makes me think like how many of us are tending and befriending versus perhaps confronting and moving forward in action that we should for our own good, right? So I often think of as moms, creating healthy boundaries, having courageous conversations with family members. I would even add in, now in this heightened awareness of anti-racism, right? Having courageous conversations around that versus going, oh, well, I'm just going to kind of avoid any of that because I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's one of those instances where no reaction is good or bad. It's the situation. And frequently it's how long you're in a reaction. So what you're talking about is this long-term stress. So you keep on getting re-triggered and re-triggered and re-triggered. And so tend and befriend is a perfectly healthy reaction. So's fight, flight, or freeze, depending on what situation it is. There's a fire. I really want you to run.
please run. Please. I would also add, right, that if you're feeling like you're going to hurt yourself or others, seek help.
Yeah.
Right.
So, all of these over time, and we know this with chronic stress, that over time, these patterns aren't necessarily the best adaptation. So I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase of a limiting belief.
Yes.
Yeah. And so my favorite definition of that is a limiting belief is a pattern of behavior, a thought or belief that used to solve a problem you no longer have. And that I cannot claim. I remember hearing that years ago on a webinar, and if I could figure out who that person was, I would quote them, but I still can't. It was one of those ahas you write down, and I never wrote down.
It's embedded in your brain.
It's embedded in my brain, and I have no idea who said it.
Yes, it is so true, right? It's something that we believe that is no longer useful for us.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even things that were problems we ever had. So this is how you get the things that you were taught by your parents or your society about like what you should do or how you should address something that maybe no longer applies to today's world. You see a lot of that in, say, the work world or education, where there's questions about, does going to college, getting the good job, working at it for 40 years and then retiring, is that really what most of us are experiencing? And the answer to that's probably no.
Well, not anymore. Yes.
Not anymore.
I would say. Yeah. It's shifted. But granted, there are many of us that still hold that belief that may stop us from taking the entrepreneurial leap that we want to take because we still believe, oh, well, I'm supposed to stay with X company, create this, loyalty with this company, have this retirement plan and whatever, only to find out, right, in some instances that we've heard where people are laid off. People are let go, companies dissolve or get, bought and taken over, and it completely changes the landscape of that organization.
Yeah. And I think that is something that women get trapped into a little bit more because of that tend and befriend. So think about all of the stress that's happening. You mentioned layoffs or a company being bought. Think about all the stress and uncertainty that's happened. What do? You default to, I've done this. So maybe I should say, what have I done? What I remember doing is I defaulted to making sure my team was okay, to, looking out for their well-being, to all of those things, and not necessarily stepping far enough away to see, oh, the ship is sinking.
Oh,
which
right.
was one of my past corporate lives things happening. And what was so important to me was to make sure that my team made it through. And I still do not regret that, but I do now know and have the lens to be able to view, oh, that was tend and befriend. I didn't decide to just like look out for number one, I'm going to like run from the sinking ship, or, get out of here while it's still good. I stuck it out for my team. And I think that corporate loyalty that is a part of business culture, I think women in particular are a little more susceptible to hanging around in situations that are not positive for themselves because of the tend and befriend stress response.
Oh, that makes me think of the classic line that I've often heard. I may have even said it myself, and I actually know that I have, wanting to stay in a relationship for the children.
Yeah. That's another example where that can come up with. Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, but I have this belief of, having this Cosby-esque family, right? And that it's all gonna work out. That yes, we all have our quirks and things, but the family unit stays together.
Mm-hmm.
But then, thankfully, at least in my case, I was able to step back enough to say, you know what, my well-being is important, and equally important, so that my son's well-being can be important as well.
Yeah. And a lot of that goes back to where we first started, which was, what does it mean when society defines things as male as the baseline and male as the best model? And so that is a man, and I should have clarified at the beginning, that is a specific man from the 19th century, from the Industrial Revolution, right? So our society, a lot of what we consider modern society, is founded in the Industrial Revolution era. So, we're looking at success from those particular lens. We're looking at family from that particular lens and what that looks like successfully. And these are the things that are still affecting us today, because they built the foundation of what we consider capitalism today, which is throughout our society, of what we consider business culture, which is throughout our society. What we, all sorts of institutions were founded at that time frame. Cities, in effect, were founded, and most of us live in cities or near cities anymore. So how they operate still affects us. And yeah, so when I say small men, I also should preface, like, we're supposed to ideally define success from a model that is a little old.
A little?
It's a little old. It's
1900s.
century or so. Yeah, a century or so ago.
I would say that's hella old. I'm just going to go on a limb and say that's very, very, very old. So I'm going to try to look at the comments without, which I've been trying to do earlier. Hello, everyone. So hi, Colleen. Thank you for joining. Yvonne, stability for you. Honestly, I can't remember what the question was. Oh, she says, oh my God, yes, though, to our conversation. And then Colleen shares, I was always discouraged to change a bad situation. I was expected to live under my father's rule and staying for that. And so what would you share with us today if we are still struggling with limiting beliefs that may or may not be our own, still struggling to fit in this, I almost want to say atypical model.
Yeah.
And let's shift it now, because, I mean, I'm not saying that we necessarily go back to, a paradigm where the woman is the head of society. I actually think we are probably shifting more towards an equal balance, right? Where it's less patriarchal. But what would you share as ways of, starting this work? Because honestly, I think it is work. It
Mhm.
is a journey. It's a process. It's not something that we're going to, oh, there we go. We just had this conversation and now we're going to be fine. As much as I wish that would
Yeah.
happen for all of us.
Yeah. So I'll start with something that we haven't touched on yet, but I mentioned earlier, I'm a big biology nerd. And one of that is depending on where you are in your life cycle. And by that for women, I mean, are you of menstrual age or are you in perimenopause or menopause? Understanding how your hormones are affecting your neurobiology. So when I mentioned this big word earlier, the infradian rhythm, like the circadian rhythm, which is 24 hours, the infradian is, I hate saying that word. I'm just so bad at it. Is your monthly cycle. And we know that a woman's brain changes neurologically about 25% throughout that cycle. So what that means is that there are times where you are, I think everyone has had this experience where all of a sudden you get the cleaning bug. Usually at certain times of your cycle, you're like, the disorganization.
Everything needs to be cleaned. Yes.
Insane. We are going to fix that. Or maybe you have, as you and I once chatted about, our BS meter is very low. And that is one of those things where when it happens in your menstrual cycle, in your monthly cycle, it's a small sign or a small glimpse of what happens in perimenopause into menopause, which is when your hormones shift down and, testosterone comes a little more on the upswing into menopause because progesterone and estrogen are now down because you are not menstruating on a regular basis in perimenopause, and then you're no longer menstruating. And one of the things that happens is your BS meter, your whatever has been bothering you will show up. So, that cranky PMS model is more that you're not showing up the same way every day. And it's more that you're not showing up like a small man than it is that there's anything wrong with you. And
right on.
Yeah. And what it is that your hormones have set your brain up to be super critical at that time. So let's acknowledge it's not all BS and it's not all in your head. And so the things that you used to have patience for, that estrogen would allow you to tend and befriend out of your stress, you don't have that crutch right now. And so you are much more likely to fight or flight. You're like, this makes me angry. I'm not going to swear. This makes me angry. Now, this may not be the best time to have those crucial conversations where you're trying to have a more difficult conversation, but it is a good time to know what you want to change in your life. This will be like your most honest, this is the thing. And so, if you just do like 5 minutes of journaling, right around, your typical PMSE, or keep a running list.
All right.
And you
PSA announcement right now.
Yeah. And you do that
when you are menstruating, PMSing, all of in that cycle, know that what is coming up for you are things that are true for you, and that it's a good time to journal, to dive into a little self-awareness, to ascertain what are you tolerating that you really don't want to? What beliefs are you holding on to that you're fighting against, that you're truly trying to like get out of that box? That is the time of heightened awareness. And I'm going to say it again, the BS meter. And I would also even take it up a notch, because at work, I used to have this bucket. It was actually our emergency preparedness bucket. But when a coworker of mine left and it was my turn to sort of have this bucket, he had put on it F it bucket. So it became my F it bucket. And sometimes in various, environments, I realize that, there's some things that I just put in that F it bucket because I'm not tolerating it anymore. And it has honestly freed me up from sort of like complaining and whining and getting so frustrated about something that I really have no control over, and recognizing, oh, well, this is what they decide. And I get to put it over here because it really doesn't pertain to me or allow me to fully express myself. It's not that I'm saying You know, oh, they want me to drive 60 miles an hour. Well, screw that. I feel like driving faster. No. Instead, it's more around, you know, stuff that normally I think I would have tried to squeeze and fit and manipulate myself into like being this ideal little man, right? And not allowing myself to feel. Instead, it was like, okay, this is causing me way too much turmoil. I'm just putting it in this effort bucket.
Yeah.
And recognizing that my BS meter has gotten fine-tuned the older I've gotten. And I love recognizing that, yeah, there are things that I don't tolerate anymore, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. It's really me stepping into my own and saying, hey, I am a woman and I am emotional and expressive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the other thing is that, you know, acknowledge the BS part, you know, acknowledge where your emotional state is. I think that's a huge part, is that because you're not going to show up in the exact same emotional state every day of your menstrual cycle, like the entire month, let's just call it a month, knowing where you're going to be. So, you know, yes, jot down those things, but also if you track your cycle, which I do, and I do a bunch of productivity things around that, which I'll get to in a second. But one of the things is know that this is going to be the week where, if you can, don't give the presentation, right? Like, don't schedule the big presentation. You know, if you are like me and you're much more introverted, this is not a week that I go to networking events when we could get out of our house to go to networking events and see people. Never thought as an introvert, I'd be like, I need to meet new people, but I'm really excited. When my part of the country gets a little more out into the phases to like actually see some new people. But again, this is not, you know, a great time to push out of your comfort zone in things, you know, to stretch your boundaries. There are definitely times, go for that. Go for the stretching of your boundaries, go for pushing out of your comfort zone. But notice that because your tolerance for the slightest thing that goes wrong, your frustration level, your BS meter is very high. That means your ability to let things roll off your back and just go with it is very low. So, you know, understand that this might make you a little more snappish with your kids than you maybe want to be. And then you feel guilt, right? Because you're not being the perfect mom, because we have all sorts of shame and blame around what motherhood looks like and whether or not you're a good mom and all of those things. So maybe set up your week. Like, if it's possible you don't like cooking, well, you know, maybe make some extra things or have some leftovers or things like that, or ask your kids or your partner or whatever to step up. Like, if it's possible to offload a couple of things that usually frustrate you that are minor things, then this is a great way to take care of yourself. Like, this is you tending and befriending yourself, right? Not forcing yourself to show up the exact same way, being like, I can handle all of these things like I normally do. You might not be able to. So, you know, acknowledge that. And that's not a bad thing. It's just where you're at in this emotional state. Because a week from now, as you come out of the menstrual cycle, you will start feeling like you can conquer the world. Like that, you know, going into ovulation is where you like come up with great ideas and you brainstorm things and your brain is lit up, and, you know, giving a presentation or something like this right around your ovulation week. Like, you ever want to ask for a raise? That's a great time. And I'm trying to remember who it was, but I saw a tagline online that was like, it was a hashtag, ovulate, create, or create when you ovulate, something like that. I think it was create when you ovulate was a hashtag. So go Google the hashtag and you can find out whoever came up with that. And I was like, that is such a great line. You know, this is when you are lit up to be literally creative. And, you know, this is when you should, if you can, schedule your annual review or your quarterly review, because you will feel magnetic and engaged. You know, if you're dating, this is when you set up a first date, because you feel like, have you ever gone into a social engagement? And as an introvert, this is rarer for me, where I'm like, I feel like I'm amazing tonight. I can talk to anyone. I don't usually feel that way, but there is a time. And, you know, when I started learning how to like follow my cycle and know these things, I now know when that time's going to be. So I now know when to plan for those things. And again, it's that there's a 25% brain shift throughout your cycle. And sometimes if you've heard of the phrase zone of genius, so that idea that you have these skills, well, what happens is that 25% magnifies these various parts of your brain. So, you know, your BS meter, your zone of genius there is really getting clear on what you really, really want. But that's also a great time, if you have this project that's been frustrating you, to sit down and break it apart and be nitpicky and figure out what's wrong, because your brain will do it well. And conversely, when you want to brainstorm, you want that to be on your, you know, upswing into ovulation, because your brain is lighting up and you're coming up with all of these great ideas. And that's a great time to brainstorm, to network, to give presentations, to make the ask for a sale, to do all of those things. And you'll feel like you can conquer the world, and you'll schedule things 2 or 3 weeks in advance, right around your period. And then that will be a train wreck.
You know, as you say, it's like, I wish I would have known this so many years ago, because there are moments where I can think of presentations where I was like, I didn't want to do it because I was feeling so, but I think I also, in some instances, either it flopped and was horrible, right? Like I just wanted to cry. But then other times I recognized whatever phase I was going into, and I gave myself time to like prepare for that in advance, right? Like knowing, oh yeah, that might be the time where Aunt Flo comes to visit. So I need to give myself a little extra self-care time, even though it's not ideal. I would love to reschedule, right?
Yeah.
But then still being able to show up. And in some instances, I think there was one time that I was just like, I am feeling just all over the place. And I used it in my presentation versus trying to like cover it up.
Yeah.
So I'm curious with everyone listening. Crystal had a question. Is there a cycle to follow for menopausal women?
Yes and no. So obviously there's not a menstrual cycle, right? But your body still does teeny little cycles, right? Like what happens is if you think of your ovaries as a hormone engine, you know, puberty is kind of like that stutter start of the engine. It doesn't quite get ready and revving. If you've ever had like an engine kind of fail on you. Right. So, you know, that sound, and then you get into the menstrual phase, or, you know, the fertile years, and you're kind of in a rhythm. And then perimenopause is when, again, that engine starts slowing down until you get to menopause. But you still produce estrogen and progesterone when you are menopausal. You just produce them at a much lower level. So one thing some women will do if they're doing this kind of work in perimenopause is that they will continue to follow this type of cycle based on their old cycle, and just kind of continue to follow through and acknowledge that. Another way to do that is to use the moon cycle, like literally the cycle of the moon, as your way of getting into these same subjects. And, you know, what you can do is if you are menopausal and you don't remember at all, like it's been years, you know, you can't look back on a calendar, then start with the moon cycle. And some women find, so there's this idea, and I don't like this per se, this is where I get a little conflicty with some of the alternative health world, is there's this idea that, you know, your menstrual cycle will track the moon in one way, and that's kind of like the better way, versus the opposite. So one being like you ovulate at the full moon, right? Like you have that whole thing. And then the other one's the opposite. And they're the one's like called a white moon and one's a red moon. I don't know. There's weird verbiage around it. And I'm not a huge fan of anything that tells people that their biology is not normal.
Wrong. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I have actually been following the moon cycle for my business, and coincidentally then sort of like going, oh, how is my menstrual cycle sort of falling into that? And so I couldn't tell you which goes with full moon or whatever, but what I recognize is it allows me to be more aware of my body, right? Like going, oh, look, the moon is waning, right? And I do start to sort of notice that my energy is going down, right? And then going, oh, well, I think I'm going to just take it slow and easy and give myself grace, right?
Yeah.
And then boom, I may be, at that point. Or then just sort of noticing like when my spurts of creativity and inspiration are, and like really hard, like diving into that and not, like hiding in the cave, instead going, okay, I'm like totally inspired. I'm going to just brainstorm and do all this stuff and start making action. Granted, the thing that I want to be highly aware of though, is not scheduling things 3 weeks in advance or for when I won't be in that state. Instead, trying to keep it very in sync when I'm like highly motivated. Because I've noticed that it's like, oh, it's sort of the introvert thing, right? You call us at 10 and say, hey, let's go out. And then by 5 o'clock, we're like, I don't really think I'm available anymore.
Like,
and it's not that we don't want to see you. It's just, the thought of like having to get dressed and then, go outside and then to go see other people, it gets a little overwhelming.
Yeah. And the reason I brought up the moon cycle and the two ways the menstrual cycle can sync or not sync to it is that I also think that if you do try the moon cycle and you Google it and you'll find all sorts of information, people will be like, oh, you should create at this point and you should, treat it, go internal at this point. If that's not working for you, try flipping it. Right. So, maybe you still gravitate towards the opposite. So, maybe when everyone else says you should be creating because you're waning into the full moon, or waxing. I always get those wrong. I think waxing into the full moon and waning afterwards. Yeah. You're going into the full moon. We'll go with that. If that doesn't seem to work for you for a month or two, then try the opposite. And maybe that one,
like that too.
Yeah. Maybe that one will work better for you because, this is a tool. And a tool only works if it actually gets you the results that you're looking for. So if the tool's not working, flip it around. And if that doesn't work, well, feel free to message me. I will try. But yeah, I think that traditionally in a lot of alternative health and traditional healing modalities, in the menopausal phase, you still follow the moon for many things. And some of that is, let's be honest, religious based, because a lot of alternative health traditions do come out of specific spiritual and philosophical beliefs around how you view the world and interact with the world. So that's also another thing, is that it's not uncommon for the idea of the moon and the female cycle to be synced. So look in your own heritage, look at various traditions. You might find something that really resonates with you with how they work with this idea and this concept, and go with that. Right? Like, and what I say doesn't matter
is in addition to listening to your body, right? But then to come up with your cycle, right? Is it 21 days? Is it 24 days? Whatever it is, but know that we all have this cyclical rhythm to our life. And it just takes a little, time and awareness to sort of get into it. And then you will start to notice, just like the revving of the engine, right? Everything starts to run smoother, and that you feel like you're tapping into more of your own personal resources.
Yeah. And if you are, since we were mostly talking about menopause, if you are still cycling, if you still have a menstrual cycle, again, I'm not a huge fan of a normal cycle. An average cycle is 28 days. I'm like, well, yes, average means there's people below and above it. It's this nifty little thing called a bell curve we all got introduced to in school. And so I also get those questions. Is it normal for me to, yes. There's when you start digging into hormonal health and questions of like what your cycle is telling you, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, it might be 31 days. It might be 32 days. You might, if you are, and I want to bring this is why I went back to the menstrual cycle, is you might discover that your ovaries actually cycle at slightly different times. So not to get too personal, but one of mine, I don't know which one, likes to give me my menstrual cycle at pretty much day 28. And the other one is usually like day 30. Sometimes it's 29, sometimes it's 30. It's not a huge shift, but it's enough. It's enough of a shift for someone who's been tracking her cycle for a very long time to see that I have a slight difference between one ovary and the other, because usually they switch back and forth. And so someone will be like, I have a completely irregular schedule. And when we cycle and when we start tracking it, you realize I'm like, no, one is just on one chunk of time and the other one's on another chunk of time. And once you know what those chunks of times are, what those specific cycles are, then you can actually really clearly predict way further out than you thought you could how you're going to feel, what's going on. You just were basing everything off this idea that one, it had to be 28 days. And two, it was going to be a set time for each month.
For each one. Yeah, that's true. We do tend to, I know, at least for myself, I'll speak for myself.
Okay.
That you sort of hear these things and then you're like, oh, well, that's how it's supposed to happen. And then you're like, oh, but it's not working like that for me. So what does that mean? I don't understand. And it's recognizing that, yes, it's based on data, taking an aggregate of what, research that they've done, and that we fit anywhere in between there.
Yeah. And just for a fun historical fact, I'm trying to remember the name of the anthropologist, but she was like one of the first big female anthropologists. And she tells this fantastic story about how she's sitting in class. And so this must have been like the 50s or the 60s. And this professor holds up a little stick that is considered, or shows a picture of a little stick that's considered like the first calendar. And it's 28 days. And he's like, it's the first calendar created by man. And she's like, this was when I had my moment of realization. What man needs a calendar that's 28 days? But again, going back to that idea of small men, what was the assumption? The assumption was that man created this calendar, right? So you could even argue, there's a decent argument to be made there that it may have been a lunar calendar. But then again, when you start looking at most cultures, you quickly find an association of the feminine to the lunar because of the menstrual cycle. So yeah, it's just little things like that. So, because I hear it every once in a while from clients, oh, well, this is great, but it doesn't really fit into my work week. It doesn't really fit into like this calendar idea. And you're like, okay, think of it as phases. So I don't want you to think that, when you ovulate for these like 72 hours, right, that you're fertile, that's like the only chunk. So if you think of it as like week 1 of your cycle, week 2, week 3, week 4, and 4 is when you menstruate, and you go through this idea, it's a general build. Your hormones don't turn on and on like that. They build up, they come back down. So you have time in here. So yeah, maybe, your peak creativity brainstorming ideas might end up being on the one weekend, right? And maybe every once in a while you decide, because you need to get some work stuff done, that you'll carve a little of your weekend out to do that. And maybe you just understand that you'll brainstorm on Friday and you'll brainstorm on Monday, and it's fine. That's enough. That is enough. So I don't want this to become another thing that we strap on our Superwoman cape and we decide we're going to be perfect and optimized and we're going to make the best of it. I don't want that to be the message coming out of this. And it can be sometimes. I've had those conversations. I'm like, deep breath. It's okay. You don't have to be perfect. Right?
No, what makes me think of is waves.
Yes.
Like when you're at the ocean and if you go into the water, right, you're watching the waves. You don't go in when the waves are coming crashing on you. I mean, granted, I've done that. My husband had us flip over in a kayak. That's another story. But when you're around water, you need to be aware of where it's going and where it's coming from, and you need to be watchful. And I would say the same thing about our cycles, our hormones, our emotions, right, is to be aware of it and notice the ebbs and flows,
flows.
and being able to ride that tide. So I want to pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions, any more questions, and to sort of double check to make sure I haven't missed any. Was it helpful for you, Crystal, in regards to menopausal women? And yeah, I'll just pause for a moment to see if anyone has any questions.
I'll keep sipping my tea. I'm happy with my jasmine green tea.
Sounds yummy. I always don't know how much of a delay there is. Yeah, I would say fundamentally, right? This conversation is about, Crystal says, thanks. Yes, you're welcome. Glad you're here. But fundamentally, this conversation is about stopping fighting our own bodies, right? It's like, instead of looking to this atypical male model.
If you're female, it is atypical for you. We can swap those words.
That, we can look to our own bodies, to our own body wisdom and intuition to harness our strengths and our abilities. And there's a release in that. There's a sense of peace and freedom in going, okay, I don't have to put on this little man suit in order to go into work. Instead, I probably wouldn't put on high heels just because I'm a Northwest girl. I will admit it. I'm comfy over, fashionable and cute. Though I like to be cute, but 3-inch, 4-inch stilettos are not my jam. But, I'd rather be comfortable and me, and however I feel like showing up that day versus, feeling like I need to put on, I do like the analogy of like putting on this male bodysuit, right? In order to achieve and exceed and do all this kind of stuff.
And I would throw in, you don't have to be, I'm not sure if obvious is the right word. Like when I first got introduced to this idea of like how my menstrual cycle could be affecting my brain and my emotions and all those things, I was still in the corporate world. I was still doing project management. And I was working on my own health issues related to my cycle. And once those were cleared up and I started kind of moving beyond that and playing with this, I, being a project manager and an account manager, was able to do things like push some meeting dates and, suggest presentation time. So I did have, I will acknowledge, I had some privilege and some ability to set some of my schedule, but I didn't have the ability to set all of my schedule. A lot of my schedule was dictated by clients as well. But I noticed, and everyone around me noticed, when I started making these little shifts in how I worked and how I blocked out times for my days for brainstorming and things like that, and did a lot of like my own work on this, it offloaded a lot of stress around the other issues that I couldn't control. So I couldn't control that I had the presentation on the not peak time of my schedule, but I could control when I brainstormed for it, when I practiced for it, when I did all of those things. And I remember having a male coworker, actually one of the sales reps, be like, you've been on fire for the last couple of months. What's gotten into you? And I'm like, I'm so not telling you the answer to that. So, you can say, this isn't like you have to completely throw out who you are at work, or, I was working in mostly male fields. So I still definitely put on the man suit in some aspects because it was the way to get by. Right. But there was still a lot that I could do to improve my own mental and emotional well-being, to manage my stress, to do all of these things. That it's like that analogy about, the duck that's floating over the water peacefully, paddling furiously underneath. So what I was doing was managing how furiously I had to paddle. What other people saw was me still floating, across the water, getting all my stuff done. But what I was regulating was trying to make the paddling in sync with how I was feeling. So I was not as stressed out, furiously being like, let's get all the things done. Let's get all the things done.
Oh my God, I love that analogy because it's so true, right? Even as women, we look at each other and think, oh my God, Jessica's so cool, calm, and collected. And we don't recognize that underneath the water, you may be paddling furiously, right? And to, you know, give each other grace that we are all paddling. We're all doing something, but we can harness our rhythms and our cycles in order to do that in a way, right? Shoot, I'll be the duck that's right in the wave in, right? Right in the wave in and not exerting as much energy. Yeah, that would be my ideal.
Yeah. And I think that for many women, that would be their ideal. But again, going back to the small man thing, if you've never been presented this as a possibility, as an ideal, then again, you think you're atypical, even though you're completely typical for the experience of a woman at work, or the experience of a woman who menstruates or doesn't, or is in perimenopause or in menopause. Your experience, lived experience, is probably very typical, but because we don't talk about it, because everything is assumed that the male model is the better model, is the base standard, then you don't feel typical, right? You will never feel typical if you are comparing yourself to what a man would biologically feel in any given situation. You just won't ever feel typical. And that's where the crazy making happens. That's where I get the questions like, I wondered, you know, if it was just me, or am I crazy? What's going on? Why am I not normal? Well, actually, no, you're very normal for a woman, just not for a man.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So true. I mean, I'm just sort of like reliving some experiences, right? Recognizing when, you know, lots of my teams were male dominated or heavy, right? To then starting to work with more women. And the various times of the month we're like, oh, we're all in the bathroom, right? It's like, oh, we've all sunk up, yay. And then just recognizing when all of us are like, you know, we're not having this anymore. So let's go talk to so-and-so and like clear the air and, you know, and it was amazing to see how collectively, when our BS meter was running high, right, that we actually got really creative in how to move different levers in order to make things better for everyone.
Yeah. And we've focused a lot on work, and it's partly because it's an area that I see a lot of this in. And it's an area that many of us have less actual control over our time and schedule. You know, you have much more control in your own personal life in many ways than you do in work, which is why I default to talking about it so much. Plus, most of us spend 40 to 60 hours a week doing this. So, you know, it's a huge chunk of our life that we like saying, oh, that's just work. But a lot in the personal development space, where I kind of end up being in the wellness space, we tend to compartmentalize, oh, well, that's work. And this is, you know, this is the self-development stuff. This is for me. And I'm like, well, okay, but you're you when you show up at work. And if you can't, if all this self-development stuff doesn't help you in something that is 50% of your time, you know, 40, 60 hours a week, then how much is it helping you? Because we don't get to live in an idealized urban, you know, fantasy world where we control everything and it's all peace
not yet.
Puppies and kittens. Yes.
Not
and you
yet.
know, yeah, not yet. And real struggles and things will happen. And you know, not everyone is as lucky as I was when I was in the corporate world in having some control over my schedule. I didn't have all of it, but I had some. So, you know, I try to focus on the things that end up being some of the most stressful, because if you can deal with that, it's real easy to roll this out into your personal life. Let's start with the harder thing. So I just bring that up because I don't want whoever is listening who hears this to be like, oh, well, that was all about work. It doesn't apply to me. You know, maybe I'm retired.
Yes.
It's like, no. I focused on work because that is one of the biggest stressors in most women's lives. And same thing, if you're a stay-at-home mom, your coordination of your kids' schedules, of all things. That's work. Let's just be clear. We, in our society, we have downplayed all sorts of women's work, whether it was positions like you being a teacher or a nurse or all of these traditionally female jobs. We downplay them as not being work. They're unpaid labor, and that's fine. They can be unpaid, but let's just acknowledge that labor is labor. It requires skill. It requires mental capacity. It requires energy. It requires scheduling abilities. It requires negotiating abilities. You know, negotiating with adults is way easier than negotiating with a 4-year-old. Like, I mean, let's be clear. So this applies to you if your work is not corporate, if your work is in the home, if you are now officially considered retired, and what you're choosing to do with your free time is learning creative things. Like maybe it's more you time, so you're going back to school, or you're just educating yourself, or you're volunteering your time. Like any area where you might make plans to show up in 4 weeks and discover that your mental state is different from when you made that plan applies.
Yes, it does. So I think beautiful. I just thank you everyone for joining us. Love the information. I think they loved the analogy with the duck. I did too. And just to sort of summarize, what would you say? I know there were so many golden nuggets throughout this entire time today. What would be 3 top things as we close? I know, trying to distill all of that. No matter where you are, you know, menopausal, perimenopausal, menstruating, just how you can, if today, to just start to tap into your own body wisdom.
So the biggest would be, if you're menstruating, start tracking your cycle, right? It doesn't have to be hard or difficult. There are apps. You can just count on a calendar, whatever works for you. There's even some cool coloring books or things. I've seen some cool coloring mandalas, like whatever works for you, literally.
Okay.
And if you're not menstruating, try Googling the moon cycle, and, you know, add that to your app calendar or whatever calendar you use, and just start paying attention. So the first step in anything is just notice. So I'm a huge fan of journaling, but I don't like giving huge homework. So if at the end of the day, you just note where you are and write 1 line or 2 about like something that frustrated you and something that you really enjoyed. Nothing bigger than that. And you will start seeing patterns, because the important part is not what I say about how your hormones should make you feel. It's how you actually experience it. And so when you start tracking your cycle, like I actually journal most days, and I literally keep a little tab, like date, day 1. You know, this is the day of the week, day of the month, day of the year, and where I am in my cycle. And I notice patterns that way, and I can go in and review. And another big one is just try journaling when you're feeling PMSy. I think that's the big breakthrough for a lot of women, is this is where you're like, these are all the things that really, really make me mad and really frustrate me. And don't tackle them then.
Just journal about them. Just write them down.
Write them down. Get all of that frustration out. Write them down. It's better that it goes out on a page than it goes out into your personal life or your family life or your work life. Write them down. Don't do anything about them yet. Like pause, and then review them at the end of your menstrual cycle. You know, in a week-ish. Review them and sit down and pick one. What is one thing that month, that next month, you could try fixing? And like anything, you need to make a goal actionable and small, right? So you might have this big work frustration thing. Find one small thing, like the one thing you can do. So if you've ever made goals for your New Year's resolutions, don't say, I want to lose weight. Don't even say, I want to lose 10 pounds. Pick an activity that might get you there. I want to eat more vegetables. So I'm going to
drink more, 8 ounces of water more each day.
Yeah, pick something that you can actually do, and then add to your journal a little measurement every day. Did I or did I not do this thing? Right? Just a yes or no. It's just a habit tracker. And I think those are the two things that can really get you into tapping into your body and then trying to apply it. And the other thing is maybe you'll try that whatever goal habit you picked and you don't like it after a couple weeks. Throw it away.
Yes.
This is
you
the
have permission.
You have permission. Write yourself your own permission slip if you need to. And this I got from Brene Brown, where, I have permission to stop doing the things that do not serve me. I have permission to, write yourself a permission slip if that's what you need. And then try something the next time. Learn from it. You may discover after a week, this, like we talked about the limiting beliefs, this is an answer to a problem I didn't quite have. I came up with the answer maybe because that's the answer that society typically says. So like losing weight is the answer society typically gives women for happiness, right? But it doesn't necessarily actually end up making you happy, right? There's other things in your life you could be doing that make you happy. So it will be a constant retuning. But the whole point is that you are checking in just once a day for less than 5 minutes, just a little notebook, like I said, a sentence or two. You're tracking. So you're seeing as it plays out, as your hormones shift, how you're actually feeling about it, right? You're going to hit that point in your cycle where you're going to feel the least motivated. And is that when certain habits you've tried multiple times and they just fall off the scale? Those aren't the habits for you. Like that's not the habit for you. If you keep on trying this thing, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different. If every single time you hit that certain point in your cycle where you're just like, and certain habits
and it goes in your effort bucket, then
certain habits consider. Yeah, certain habits go out the window and others stay. Well, then just keep the ones that stay, right? Give it a second shot. Maybe that was just that month. But again, you have permission to stop doing things
right on.
that do not serve you.
So who's up for the challenge of noticing, journaling, and then picking one small habit to tackle? I would love to know. And this has been fabulous. So thank you everyone for joining us. And